Welcome to Foresight's Space Group, where we are lucky to have Clémence here talking about cyberwar in outer space and how it applies to Ukraine. So please take it away.
Thank you very much, Lydia. So thank you all for having me. So yes, indeed, we're going to talk about cyber threats against space systems and more broadly against the space sector and take the case study of the war in Ukraine to see what happens and what are the consequences on military operations and where this cyber attacks are happening. So first, you guys all know that the war in Ukraine started with cyber attack against a satellite network, against Viasat. So I'm not going to go into the details because I guess you all know a bit about this case, but basically what the Russians did a few hours before the invasion is that they launched first a denial of service against user terminals of the Viasat KASAT satellite network that were used by the Ukrainian military. They pushed illegitimate traffic into the network, which made it very difficult for legitimate modems to stay online. And then in a second step, they exploited a unpatched vulnerability in the VPN network of the ground segment of Viasat. And they managed to get into the network, move deeper into that network, and upload a wiper malware, which eventually erased the hard drive of all the user terminals. And not only it prevented Ukraine from using SATCOM to respond to the invasion, it also disabled a lot of sensors that were connected to the satellite network in Donbass. So basically, a lot of things that enabled the Ukrainian military to see what was going on there was suddenly blind. And they had to switch to terrestrial systems. Of course, this attack created ripple effect all across Europe, with customers in Germany, France, Hungary, Greece, Italy, Poland being affected. And they were affected for months because this attack was quite destructive and Viasat needed to ship new modems to all the users, and it took months to do this. So sometimes in remote areas, if you don't have terrestrial systems, they didn't have any internet. And this attack also impacted critical infrastructure like wind turbines. They didn't stop working, but they could not be controlled anymore, which is also a big issue. And so in my research, what I wonder is that if the war started with this, how many other cyber operations happened against space system and against the space sector? And I found a lot more. Overall, in between the day of the invasion in 2022 and today, I have over 150 cyber operations that targeted the space sector on both sides of this conflict. And you can see that on the slides that the victims are all across space agencies, companies. So you see Viasat again was targeted, Boeing, the European Space Agency, NASA, Lockheed Martin, Maxar, the Ukrainian Space Agency, the French Space Agency, the Swedish Space Agency, Safran, NOAA, Leonardo, Avio, SES, and more on the Russian side, the Russian Space Agency, Research Institute of the Russian Academy of Science, Gazprom Space Systems, some satellite TV channels, internet service providers that rely on satellite communications, GLONASS, etc. There's quite a lot, and there's not so many publications or research that lists all these cyber operations. So I tried to understand what it meant and what it says about the threat landscape. So what I saw is that most of these operations are not so sophisticated. It's mostly DDoS operations. 11 of them were intrusions in space systems or space companies or agencies. 9% of them were hack and leak operations. So usually company data, customer databases, private information about staff, this kind of things. But what is interesting is that the wiper malware, which is the type of attack that happened with Viasat, is not really common. It's very sophisticated, and I couldn't find any other example. Doesn't mean that it didn't happen, but at least there's no public information about it. Overall, I found 12 pro-Ukrainian and 19 pro-Russian groups that targeted the space sector, and there were a rather balanced ratio between pro-Russian and pro-Ukrainian operations. But pro-Ukrainian operation mostly targeted only the Russian space sector, when pro-Russian ones targeted the Ukrainian space sector, but also all Western space sector. So most 13% of operations targeted the Ukrainian space sector and 23% US space sector. We see also a trend here. Then what I found in terms of targets is that 57 different entities in the space sector were targeted by cyber operations, and 61% of operations targeted space companies. It's quite unsurprising considering the amount of commercial systems and services that are used in this conflict. So they're really seen as by threat actors. And now we can check, of course, some examples. First, you guessed it, Starlink is targeted quite a lot. And here I wanted to mention this example because it's a very unsophisticated operation, but that had a lot of impact. So here, KillNet, this is a pro-Russian hacktivist group. They launched a cyber operation, which is very simple, like a DDoS, on the website and the authentication portal of Starlink. And because Starlink is a service, if you want to use it, you need to log in on the online portal. And just by disabling that, then all the users could not connect anymore. So they could not use Starlink anymore. And a lot of users were complaining about the fact that the system was down, that they could not connect. And this operation affected also Ukrainian users and the Ukrainian military. So sometimes something very simple that lasts a few hours can have some consequences. And in the military operations, you need to communicate between your soldiers, you need to communicate to raise alerts in case of assaults or troop movements, you need Starlinks for drone feeds, and etc. So if it doesn't work for a few hours, it has quite a lot of consequences. Another attack that is quite interesting on the Ukrainian side this time is they decided to target the Gonets satellite network. It's a satellite communication network. And they noticed, the attackers, they said that they noticed that the Russians were monitoring the system quite well, but they still managed to get into this network. And they realized that there was a CRM database, and they wanted to get into it to see if there were some military customer. And they realized that they could not download the CRM database because there was a firewall and they couldn't go around it. And what they saw is that they could delete the database. And what is interesting is that each time a user was requesting to use the service, this CRM database was checked to see if the user was a real subscriber and paid their subscription. So if they were deleting the database, that means that the entire system was failing. So something that was created to prevent piracy suddenly became a single point of failure and a weakness. And so they deleted the CRM database, and suddenly 97 Russian government organizations and companies could not access satellite communication. And so again, this action, this operation did not target the satellite in orbit. It only targeted the IT environment of the company and targeted the CRM database, the customer database. They didn't need to target the satellite in orbit. Another example here, quite interesting, is that ICEYE, the Finnish Earth observation company, they signed a contract to provide images to Ukraine. And when they released this press release that you see on the screen, suddenly a Russian hacktivist group decided to target them. And what is funny is that they decided to target ICEYE because of the signature of this contract. But then you see on the screen in their Telegram message that they provided the wrong URL, and they provided the URL of ESA. And it's a bit unclear whether they misunderstood the relationship between ICEYE and ESA, because ICEYE does provide images to ESA as well. But ESA is not in any way, shape, or form related to the war, does not provide images to Ukraine in any way. Either the activists didn't understand, or maybe this is a mistake, but probably not, because they reshared this message several times a few months afterwards. And here they targeted the European Space Agency. So when you're an agency and you're not involved in conflict, it doesn't really matter. You still have to protect yourself because you can still be targeted. And here again, They didn't target a satellite in orbit or anything. They just targeted a website. Another example here is also linked to what is going on with the war, is that Sweden welcomed a Nordic peace summit at some point and to discuss peace negotiations about the conflict and help to Ukraine, etc. And so when this summit happened, this pro-Russian group, No Name, decided to target Swedish websites of various kind, not specific to space. And among the victims were the Swedish Space Agency. And the agency doesn't have anything to do with the summit or with the war in Ukraine, but they were still targeted. Again, no satellites in orbit was targeted, but they still became affected. So it's really important to understand that this is only the tip of the iceberg and that there's probably way more attacks than is reported with open source information. And it's really hard to map state actors' activities. And what we see a lot is hacktivist groups, but not a lot of very sophisticated state actors' activities are reported. So I listed some stats that I could find with open source investigations. And so you see that current literature, they only list, for instance, 113 attacks all across the sector from the 50s to 2022. So it's very low. Cyber Inflight, which is a market intelligence company, they counted 337 cyber attacks since the 70s, 90 in 2023, and 30 in January 2024. So this is more accurate, but this is not a complete comprehensive overview. I found 124 between 2022 and 2024. Now I'm up to 50. For 2025, I found 68 operations related to Ukraine or not against the space sector. But this is very low because when we compare with what agencies are declaring, it's 1,700 cyber incidents for NASA in 2020. For ISRO, the Indian Space Agency, they declared 100 cyber attacks per day. Space Isaac in the US, they said over 100 attacks per week against the space sector. So there's really not a lot of visibility on cyber operations. But what we can learn from threat actors is that there's no hacker group dedicated entirely at targeting space sector. And it's quite the opposite, actually. The threat actors, they often say that when they target the space sector, they say, oh, this was very difficult for us to understand how the satellite network functioned and how to target it. It took us a lot of time to exploit a vulnerability or to move deeper into a network. They also sometimes, in a very childish way, ask themselves whether this is possible to hack a satellite. So there's still an information gap that is there from threat actors group. OpenAI and Microsoft, they also released information that some Russian hacktivist group also searched for information about telecommunication satellites and how to target them on ChatGPTs and the likes. So you still see that there's a skill gap in this field, but AI is probably going to fill it. So then maybe we're going to see more cyber operation against the space sector. What we also see is that hacker groups, they can behave in a way that does not necessarily align with the state they support. So for example, sometimes you see hacker groups that are pro-Ukrainian, and they might react to what Elon Musk says, for instance, and disagree with what he said about the conflict. And those hacktivists might decide to target him or Starlink. But at the same time, the Ukrainian government, they cannot afford to have Starlink down for a few hours. So even though they're both pro-Ukrainian, they have conflicting objectives in the short and long term sometimes. So this is something always to keep in mind when you integrate hacktivist groups into your cyber operations. What we also see is that self-attribution is now very commonplace for a hacktivist. They're looking for visibility and praise online by targeting the space sector. But state actors, they rarely communicate about operations that target them. Now, what I saw in my research is that hacktivist claims they're very hard to prove. So a few groups were caught lying about some of their operations. They see hacking the space sector as something that is cool, let's say, and they might sometimes claim to have hacked a GPS receiver or something like that, or a satellite network. And then you figure out that when you look at the data, that it's probably not true, or they might leak information about a space company. And then you realize that they reused data from an old leak and that it's not them that breached the system. So it's hard to figure out what is true and what is real. But for them, it doesn't really matter because a lot of them don't really care so much about generating effects. They just want visibility, and sometimes just a DDoS on a website gets them the media attention that they want. Or if it's cyber attack against a space system and something is down for a few minutes, sometimes it's enough for them to claim a successful attack. But what is very interesting when I look at a lot of Telegram channels and hacker group forums is that they're really fascinated about space. And you don't really see that for other sectors like automotive or even aviation. They talk about fun facts about the space sector, like the first time coffee was brewed on the ISS, or they talk about moon missions, this kind of things. They have news digest about the IT sector, and usually they also integrate news about the space sector. They celebrate the day of cosmonautics in Russia, for instance, so they talk a lot about space as a way to engage with their community, and it's a way for their members to discuss something in their chats. So that's quite interesting compared to other verticals. Now, as the conflict is ongoing, and a thing that is interesting is that pro-Russian groups, they're also teaming up with pro-Palestine groups. They create partnerships with one another, and they cooperate and coordinate their actions. And several pro-Russian hacker groups that took sides with pro-Palestinian groups, but they also sometimes sign official alliances and announce alliance between their groups. So, for instance, Gostek, which is a pro-Russian group, they claimed the cyber attacks against Genesis receivers in Israel, and they did the same thing also in the context of the war in Ukraine. Anonymous Sudan, which is neither part of Anonymous nor from Sudan, but more of a pro-Russian hacker group, they claimed also attacks against GNSS receivers following October 7. And so that's something that is another trend that is emerging in links with other conflicts. So now the impact on the battlefield is that so far cyber attacks on satellites used to be rather rare as part of armed conflict. It was mostly electronic warfare, but not so much cyber attacks against satellites. But when you look at the war in Ukraine, that most operations and cyber operations related to the war are a significant part of all cyber attacks ever conducted against the space sector. So it's really a shift in how the space sector is perceived by hacker groups. They understood that it's essential for military operations, hence being interesting targets. And it can be expected that cyber attacks on satellite networks will be more prevalent in future conflicts. So my next report will be about operations against the space sector in the Israel-Palestine conflict. And so far, I'm only at the beginning, but I already find 97 operations. I guess this is definitely a trend. And then to the question, is there cyber war in outer space? The thing is, in my research, I couldn't find any example of a cyber attacks that directly targeted the space segment. So all of the operations targeted the ground segment, the user segment, the IT environment of the company, but I couldn't find one examples where they targeted the space segment. Probably there are examples, but I couldn't find anyone with open source information. And I couldn't find co-orbital cyber operations from one satellite to another. So it's not directly happening in orbits. It prevents satellites from working sometimes, but it's not directly happening in orbit. So you don't have a weaponization of outer space, like a placement and use of cyber weapons in space. This weaponization is still an emerging phenomenon. It's coming, it's increasing, but you don't see this yet with cyber operations. So they're mostly targeting space systems on Earth. And then when we look at the battlefield, it's also important to mention that most of those cyber operations, they're not part of joint operations. They're related to the conflict, related to what is going on, to news related to the conflict, but it's not like you have the military that is coordinating very precisely land, sea, and air operations and cyber operations to target space systems at the same time, or to supplement a land operations with a cyber attack against a satellite. It's very difficult for the military to conduct truly joint operations and coordinate all domains. So it's more groups that conduct operations in a way that is related to the conflict, but not in a way that is fully coordinated. So I think this is an important aspect as well. So if you have any questions, feel free to ask. You can find the report online. Thank you for having me.
Thank you very much for that. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. So I would like to start it off by asking a question, which is, there are other kinds of space attacks other than cyber. Have you looked into that at all? There's threats of collisions, there's anti-satellite weapons, there's blinding with lasers, there's RF attacks. Beyond just hacking, these are more kinetic or traditional types of attacks. Have you followed any of that? Because I think there was some of that with Ukraine. In fact, I know.
Yes, indeed. And there's a lot of electronic attacks. So jamming and spoofing. This is very present, and I would say it happens on a daily basis. Sometimes it's a bit difficult to distinguish whether it's a cyber or electronic operation, because you can achieve the same result as jamming and spoofing with a cyber operation. So sometimes it's difficult to truly assess every step of an attack and its type, especially with open source information. But it also happens in a similar way where you also have satellite TV channels that are being targeted, with maybe sometimes hijacked, with propaganda being displayed. And it's not necessarily related to the battlefield, but it's related to the conflict. For instance, it happened to a cartoon channel for kids that was hijacked several times, and Russian propaganda was displayed, including war footage. This is something that is more in the side of electronic warfare, but maybe integrate some cyber components for reconnaissance, for instance. So this is definitely something that is going on. You also sometimes have the hijack of satellite-based radio systems that are used for missile alerts for the civilian population. And they hijack this, and then it creates a bit of panic because they might send fake missile alerts asking people to go to shelters and so on, and when there's actually nothing. So this is also happening. And while this is happening on the ground, it's difficult to say whether it's related, coordinated or not, but you also have some activities in orbit. You probably all know the Fluche Olympe satellites that is maneuvering and eavesdropping on a lot of satellites in GEO. And so it's hard to say whether anything is coordinated or related directly to the conflict, but you definitely have other types of operations going on as well. So electronic, physical, and naturally, a few months before the invasion, you also had Russian anti-satellite tests as well. Again,
yeah, I want to mention that for the moment. Since you brought it up, it's not exactly a cyber attack, but it is certainly the case that Russian ASAT test, which was, as usual, they blew up one of their own satellites. So it wasn't arguably a direct attack, of course, space war thing, but that created a temporary debris field, and a lot of satellites, and I speak here with obviously firsthand knowledge, after that Russian ASAT test, right before the invasion, a lot of LEO surveillance satellites had to do a lot of maneuvering and hence had to prioritize maneuvers over imaging. So that was, in a sense, effectively a military action, even if they could claim, oh no, it was just a test.
Yeah, exactly. That's totally right. And I don't think it prevented analysts from figuring out that there was a military buildup at the border at that time, that it's not like there were no satellite images or other sensors that gather information about this. So it's not like it prevented analysts to figure out this, but
actually did. It actually did. And again, I can speak from some first-hand experience here. because the debris flux was increased for many weeks after the ASAT test, it did prevent imaging satellites from doing some imaging because they had to do maneuvering instead to avoid collisions. It did have an effect on the availability of imagery of the conflict region.
Okay. Okay, I didn't know that.
The
That's
biggest,
super interesting.
the biggest effect was really more about just an indicator that this was not an exercise. When I'm not a military strategist, so I'd love to actually hear from you, Clemence, on this. But my understanding is in deterrence theory, it is, do you have the capability of doing something, and what's the threshold to which you would act? And would you actually, and what this showed is they would put cosmonauts at risk, that their threshold to act is lower, that you are dealing with an adversary that is a bit more, that's changing the rules of the game. So I saw that as an early indication of aggressive activity, that this is, that, yeah, you use more in deterrence theory rather than actually in denying imagery or access to information from space.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think it was really a demonstration of power to signal that they are capable of doing this, and that it could be one escalations in the conflict.
But again, there's the capability of doing it, and it's the threshold to act. It signaled the threshold to act was much lower than before.
Yeah, true.
Okay, I'm not on video right now because I'm parking. Does anyone else wish to add a question or a comment to the dialogue? If so, please just speak.
There's a little thing I wanted to toss in about that same anti-satellite event. Specifically, it also really taxed a lot of the ground-based sensors that track and organize information about stuff in space. So there was definitely a systematic degradation in the overall quality of that data landscape when that happened.
I see. So you're saying that the space surveillance network was impacted?
Yeah, both government and commercial had to do a bunch of scrambling. You guys definitely had to do a bunch of maneuvering, and a lot of other folks basically had data that got degraded because there was different priorities around imaging and radar time, which is a kind of finite and fixed resource. Sounds silly, but there's some amount of time you spend establishing where particular objects are. And the more you spend on debris, the less you spend on things you love and care about mostly.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, does anyone have their hand raised or anyone want to say anything? I don't see any. Is there stuff in chat? No.
I
Oh,
see
boy.
one question in the chat about Lockheed and why they were targeted. So it was very funny because hacker groups, they target defense companies because of the weapons that they produce that are then used in Ukraine. And so they target those companies because of their defense activities. But then, and hacker groups didn't really realize that they also do space. And so, for instance, one pro-Russian groups targeted Lockheed, and all the data that they could find was data about cooperation with NASA. So they got into their network, and then they were like, oh, we only find things about space and NASA, and they didn't realize that it was a big part of their work as well. And then they didn't stop them, but they were definitely, and they admitted that it was uncommon for them. And it's the same for Boeing as well. It really also shows that you can become in hackers' crosshair inadvertently, and you might get targeted for another reason, but then have leaks of data about space missions or space technology.
Also, if they target Starlink or something like that, that can have just global effects and not just regional conflict effects.
It sounds in this case, it was being a defense prime and again, unsophisticated attack of their web assets and frankly in the wrong part of the company. It sounds.
Yes.
Are there problems with attribution? Just because somebody makes a claim on Telegram doesn't mean that they're the actual perpetrators. And you can imagine false flags and people trying to blame shift or just make confusion. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, you have a lot of hacktivists that lie about operations. So you see in a lot of these hacker groups, they're sometimes very good at communications and gathering teams and communicating about DDoS attacks on websites, etc. But when it comes to more sophisticated attacks, Some of them are very good and they have a lot of capabilities, and sometimes they also cooperate with states. But for some of them, they sometimes lie about some operations and there's no proof that they ever conducted it. Or sometimes they might say they did something because they saw something in the news and they claim the operations. We see it these days with various claims of attacks on the X website. But so it's definitely difficult to not be intoxicated with wrong information. So you always have to be cautious and always think that maybe what you find is not true. So as a researcher, I still monitor it, but if you're a space company and you have to monitor cyber threat against your company and system, it's always worth it to then double check. And because a lot of operations, I think, go unnoticed or breaches go unnoticed, and you have a lot of noise and a lot of groups that do a lot of unsophisticated operations, but then you have just a very few threat actors that are very good, that have a lot of capabilities, and those are the ones that you have to really worry about and make sure they're not in your system.
Okay, one last question I'm going to ask before I'm out is the title of the talk was, Is there cyber war in space? And a lot of this is talking about ground attacks on ground infrastructure, websites, ground terminals, et cetera. Are there examples that you know of actual hacking in space? What I mean by that is like someone actually disabling a satellite or taking over a satellite by corrupting its flight software or its downlinks or anything like that.
I couldn't find any example related to the war in Ukraine. So it's certainly possible to do it, but I couldn't find any example that are related to the conflict. So that's why I was like emphasizing that there's not really a cyber war in orbit. It's more against space systems on the ground.
Okay. Robbie.
Yeah, and first of all, this was an excellent presentation. Thank you, Clemens. I really enjoyed seeing it from all this open source information, and I think the major takeaway is that activists are very fascinated about space, and that it will probably increasingly become more of a target and more sophisticated over time as people understand what the network is and how to actually get in. I'm curious if you found any groups where CISOs, security officers inside companies and organizations, are sharing information with each other around some of the activities that they see every day. And if it's through ISAC or if it's through anything else, but I think it would be very useful for there to be a good think tank, nonprofit, academic organization that's trusted by groups of people who have very sensitive information, so that you have additional sources of information in order to sense make the threat landscape. So have you been able to tap into any of those networks?
Yeah, I'm collaborating regularly with the Space ISAC. So we exchange a bit, and I consulted them also before I released my report to see whether it was rather correct and representative of the threat landscape and what's going on. So of course, the methodology here was really just open source information. So I'm completely aware that there's a lot more than this. So yeah, but I completely agree that there's also a need to have a better view of cyber threat intelligence for space systems, and that there's not necessarily a lot of visibility for a lot of companies. Sometimes I discuss with them and they don't really do a lot for cybersecurity, especially if it's scientific or exploration missions. They don't see why they would be targeted. They don't think about it. So there's still a lot of awareness raising to do. But for the few operations and companies, I think now commercial companies or observation companies that provide images to Ukraine, etc., they are very aware of the threat. They share information between each other, and you have examples that the industry can learn from. Not enough, I think, but I think that's in one way, Viasat, for instance, was a good example, because now the entire industry can learn from this example because it's so public, and there we had quite a lot of information about it. In some ways, it's a good awareness, unfortunately, a good awareness raising campaign, and to make sure that space company realize that they can be targeted. But yeah, I think there's not enough publications about cyber threats, because it's quite, I struggle a bit to find all those operations for sure.
Yeah, keep going because it's very important. And I think it's only going to increase. And it's important for these lessons to be learned and shared, and then for new operators immediately to architect their systems in such a way that's as secure as possible. So thank you for that work and service. One thing that I'm curious about is, or that I'm concerned with, is I do believe that probably the first catastrophic space activity that will occur will happen in low Earth orbit, and it will happen to a commercial satellite, and it will be hard to trace it back to who it was from. And so and it would be like a permanent outage of a satellite. Their lack nation policy and posture for response, I think by design, so that it's not escalatory. And so in your research, I would also start to be looking for where are the ground-based lasers that can permanently disable and deny a sensor, and then start to think through the early indications of if that threat posture is high, because satellite operators can then change their ConOps in such a way that they can then mitigate being a target. Have you done any research on that, or are there people doing research on that in the open source field?
There's definitely like scenario building, cyber ranges on potential attacks, or a combination of different operations that can have cyber and physical effects, and that can generate physical impact in LEO, but also about attribution. So for instance, we did with students a scenario about incident response and about jamming on ground stations. And so there was like a whole scenario, and they couldn't really find the cause. And it was either an intentional jamming from a mega constellation, but maybe jamming from ground stations that have been repurposed for electronic warfare purposes, or maybe a cyber operation against a ground segment. And so we tried to do a bit of a role play and see what kind of solution were possible and how to find the attacker and the cause of the attack. So it's very exploratory, and it's not a real case. So I didn't do any research on this from real cases. I don't know if some people are doing research on this, but that's certainly a good point. And I definitely agree with you. I think there's definitely a possibility of coordinated cyber operations against the radar, for instance, to at the same time as a physical operation in LEO, so that you don't really know when and where an incident started, or maybe a satellite moves to approach another satellite, and at the same time all the SSA sensors are disabled or something like that. So I think that's definitely a plausible thing.
Robbie, Adam here. This stuff is so sensitive and so dangerous that, like, attribution being the number one problem, that I don't think anyone's going to admit to any of these problems being public. And so in order to have a good understanding of the threat profile, I think we have to take one step out of that epistemics and just be a little bit more creative about what is possible and what's easy to implement, what systems are already in place that can be activated if the intention already gets there. The laser weapons that could blind satellites are certainly mobile enough to be moved in 2 weeks, and will be co-located with the most sensitive nuclear or military activities of the other countries and their launch opportunities. So around Kazakhstan, around Western China, I think it's pretty easy to anticipate that those areas are going to be quite dangerous in a hot conflict for imaging satellites.
Okay. Is there anybody else, or do we wrap it up? I want to just ask one quick question, Clemens. Are you in touch with the Secure World Foundation?
A little bit, yeah. I used to work at SP, so we were working a lot with Secure World, but we don't have any projects right now with them. But
I think they'd be very much interested in seeing this talk. Maybe I'll send Brian a link to the video, but you might find a receptive audience if they have a seminar series or if they bring in speakers.
That's a good idea.
I have one more, or a general foresight questions to round up the seminars, which is that Something that people are always curious about is, if you want to put a speculative hat on just for a moment, and we all know this is speculation now, but if you're projecting outward to the next 5 years or something, are there any specific threats that you think we really need to take into account, or are there specific defensive solutions that you think we can be building now that would really make an impact in 5 years? Basically, if you just take yourself out from the current existing conflicts, like, what's the big picture here in 5 to 10 years?
Yeah, one thing is definitely quantum computing and quantum encryption, post-quantum encryption. I think it's really important that space companies start securing the data of their data and the data of their customers right now, that they start this transition right now with post-quantum encryption, so that when we have, at some point, we'll have, or someone will have quantum computers, they will be able to better protect themselves. It's a very slow process, especially in big organizations, to change all this. So I think that's definitely something that needs to start now. You need to continue to research on this. It's not easy and it's very expensive. So I expect a lot of space companies to not do this transition in time because it's so expensive and maybe difficult technically. And so if you're a space startup, you might not put this as a priority. The second thing, I think, is, for a long time, the space sector was not so concerned about customers' data because we didn't really have commercial services. We had systems and you would transfer the ownership. So you didn't have subscribers and a lot of customers. But right now with systems like Starlink, or even if you have clients in satellite imagery, you have a lot of databases. With satellite communications, you have a lot of data about their web browsing data and a lot of personal information that you have to protect. So I think when I look at the dark web, I see a lot of customer databases increasingly. Before, because there were no customers or so few, it was not an attractive target for cyber criminals, but now it is because there are many customers. So I think that's something that is going to become an increasing issue. And then, I think we're going to see a lot more cyber operations from China. They certainly have the capabilities. They are operations already, but I'm pretty sure that this trends with hacktivist groups, it's also going to emerge as tension increase between the US and China.
Yeah, the quantum encryption problem is like something that like most organizations will face. And it's really hard to determine like how bad is this going to be, because it might be extremely bad across the board. It's a problem in the space sector, but it's almost a problem like across the board and in most ecosystems, really, if it's actually as bad as one might think. And it doesn't really seem like we have amazing solutions right now, but Okay, great. And any defenses that we can build now, like on the positive side? Do you think we can prep in any useful ways?
I think,
if only we had, because if you now think, perhaps we had known about this one specific thing 5 years ago, if only we had built infrastructure with that in mind, we would be in a better place. We're now in that place with respect to the next 5 years. Is there something specific that you would just encourage folks to have in mind as they're like scaling up their operations in space?
Yeah, I think it's first, it's about the awareness, knowing your adversaries, knowing the threat landscape, updating your threat models regularly, even if you might think that you might not be affected by something like an armed conflict, that you have nothing that is not related to your activities, you might still be impacted. So you need to update the threat model regularly, increase cyber threat intelligence, and, as Robbie said, increase discussion and cooperations among CISO and cyber experts within space companies. And you have to learn as you fight. I think there's a skill gap still a bit in the space sector and in cybersecurity, but there's definitely an increased interest in this domain. So I think it's difficult to give advice because it's very complicated thing to protect an entire space infrastructure, because you will still be targeted and you have to protect against every type of attack, while attackers have to find one vulnerability, one weakness. So first, if you know your adversaries, it's a lot easier.
Go for it, Adam.
I was talking with a cybersecurity executive at Space Systems Command, and their number one problem is the really easy stuff. The human factor in cybersecurity, people still writing passwords on notepads. I think the white pill here is that cybersecurity, 90% of it, 80% of it is still really easy. Change your passwords, don't write them down, don't share your passwords over unencrypted services. And beyond that, there's advancements in communications and cybersecurity technologies that I think will be implemented systematically across industry. Just as a matter of fact, I have two-factor authentication on everything, even though I don't like it, but it's just been forced on me. I think we'll see similar things here. I think it's a moving target. I think it's an adaptive system. I think if you just do the easy things, you're ahead of most people.
Yeah, we have a big
exactly. I see a lot lately, a lot of space agencies, online portal that are being infected with infostealer malware. And usually it comes from users' mistakes, phishing emails, the wrong thing was clicked, and then it gives access to space agency or space company portals. Yeah, that's definitely a big issue.
We have a big security track at Foresight, and we're giving a prize once a year on making secure systems securely usable, because usability is usually a problem. So sometimes we know how to build them, but no one's using them in the secure way, so it doesn't really matter that they could, in theory, be secure. Okay, final question. I know we're at time here. Is just, if people are excited about your work, how can they support you? What's next on your agenda? Basically, how can people find you? Any kind of like requests that you have for this group and beyond? Now is a great time to perhaps close with that.
No, thank you so much for the exchange. I actually learned a lot and it was super interesting. Yeah, you can find my publications on ETH Zurich website, and my next report will be bit of a similar methodology, but for the Israel-Palestine conflict. And yeah, we'll look a lot also about conflict mediation in space, which is more of a expertise domain of Switzerland, how maybe the tradition of good offices and mediation in conflict can be extended to space.
Very cool. Okay, let us know when the research out. We'd be very excited to have you back. Thank you so much for joining, and thanks everyone for chiming in. I also learned a lot. I really appreciate it. Have a good one.
Thank you.
Thank you.